Good afternoon, YouTubers, and welcome to another adventures in steam heating. Today we're going to be discussing the thermostatic single pipe steam radiator valve. I have two basic examples. The first one here is made by Danfoss, and there's another one here by Macon, and we've got a Danfoss unit in my hand, and it consists of a couple of main parts. You've got a radiator vent, you've got a actuator and temperature setting limiting control, and you've got a vacuum breaker. Now, normally what you have on a single pipe freestanding cast iron radiator is an angle vent. This threads into the 1/8 inch hole at the side opposite of the shutoff valve, and it allows the escape of air, and when the steam hits this eventually, the vent will shut against the steam. This particular one, which is a #1 vent right, is adjustable in how much air can escape, and so you can control the amount of heating grossly in a radiator. But if you have a situation where you have a very large radiator in a very small room, or it gets a lot of sun during the day, the room tends to overheat, then this particular device may be useful for you. So you unscrew the radiator vent and thread it in there. And you can see this one here is bent because this thing is pretty weighty and tends to distort that, so you got to be careful. So I've cut it open to show how it's supposed to work. So the boiler fires. This does not fire the boiler. It's not designed to add heat to a system. It's designed to restrict the heat. And you can see that's really bent there. The air exits through here, exits around this washer, goes up through into the vent and out here. If this thing is, say, set at 5 or larger, then what could happen is the radiator will heat all the way, and the vent will act like a normal radiator vent, or should. If you set the desired temperature based on that indicator, and that's about usually where most people want to keep it. That's usually right about 3 is about 68, 70 degrees. So if it gets to be 70 degrees in the space before the radiator begins to heat, this shuts this and prevents the loss of air from the radiator, and therefore keeps the steam out of the radiator. You control the steam in the radiator by controlling the release of air. The vacuum breaker comes into importance in that if this is shut and there's steam in the radiator, and then the boiler turns off and the steam begins to condense, what can happen is that the condensing steam will form a vacuum, a partial vacuum, and draw more steam towards that radiator, negating what this is trying to do if this is shut off. So what's happening, what then happens is then air is drawn in through the vent, down this pipe, through this little passageway here, through the vacuum breaker, allowing air to enter into the radiator and keeping any more steam from entering the radiator, preventing the radiator from overheating. This thing can be, this thing does break, so you got to watch this. And the other thing that can happen is that the system could be run at too high of a pressure, or more subtly, it never shuts off. Steam system has got to shut off. The system has got to be able to draw air into the radiator, trapping more air in the radiator so this device can function. If the if the boiler never shuts off and is constantly supplying steam pressure, this thing will be overridden, and you will be disappointed in its performance. So this is the Macon example, and it's pretty much a variation on a theme. Generally, you get the body, very much like the Danfoss unit. This one hasn't been used. This is where the actuator pushes in. Let's see if I can get that. There's not a whole lot of travel there. Doesn't need much. This is threaded on, and this is their version of a vacuum breaker. I believe this is, I think, probably sourced through Barnes & Jones. It looks like one of their vacuum breakers. It's a little bit more robust than the one with Danfoss. That's not necessarily to your advantage, because then this is heavier, and then puts a lot of torque on this out here. So you have the actuator threads on here, and then you have your vent here, like so. It's pretty ungainly, but if it works, it works. Now the actuator, again, is not interchangeable. I had an example here. So this threads on like so, and you have a number that you can dial in from snowflake, which is obviously off, to 9, which correlates more or less to settings and temperature, which is in the instructions. But if you have a situation where the radiator is, say, encased in a radiator cover, if you have this actuator in there, this won't function reliably, because it will detect the it will shut prematurely, and you might not get much heat at all. So you have to have a remote sensor. The disadvantage of a remote sensor is that this capillary tube can be kinked or broken. There's a fluid inside which is contained in this sort of hydraulic system, and it's ethyl acetate, I believe, and it will eventually bleed away after a number of years and a number of cycles. The direct mount unit, and Macon does make a direct mount unit. They're largely variations on a theme. The direct mount unit has a wax motor, which is not very volatile at all. So these things tend to last years longer than the units. Danfoss, the same thing. It's same weakness. Anytime you have this capillary tube, sometimes you can drill a hole in your radiator cover and have this sitting outside of your radiator cover. As you can see, also you have to have a fairly large clearance to be able to put this and install this and make it work. So again, it depends on your situation. You've got to understand how your boiler is working, and whether or not you absolutely need this or can use an easily adjustable vent right, rather than go with this high-tech solution. But when these work, they work. To kind of understand their principles of operation and their limitations. I hope that answers all of your questions. And as always, if you have any more, or didn't quite understand my rushed explanations, please ask questions below. And again, I thank you for your support, and Take care.